Hello and welcome to this GSA LINC-AD webinar. This is the third of our series. If you missed the other two, they are available on the GSA website. My name is Jen Pettis and I'm the Director of Strategic Alliances for the Society. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of housekeeping information before our colleague Sam introduces our speaker for today. We'll go on to the next slide. So for housekeeping, please let us know who you are in the chat. If you'd introduce yourself and where you're dialing in from today, we'd love to know who's joining us. We are recording this conversation and it will be archived, as will a PDF of the presentation be made available as a handout there. We ask that you keep your video off during the program and your audio muted until it's time for discussion. And for discussion, we'll ask that you use the chat box to include any questions or comments that you have. We'll have ample time for those at the end. And certainly if you have any technical issues, you can let us know there as well. And if you like the format of today's program, please join us and invite your friends for future programming. We have lots of webinars going on with GSA, and we'll certainly have another series like this in the future. And we'll go on to the next slide. And let's see, we are open for one more day. So tomorrow, today is March 8th. So you have until tomorrow to please get your abstract submissions in for GSA 2023. We are going to be in Tampa, Florida from November 8th through the 12th. And we have heard great things about the convention center. It's right on the water. And it is, I guess, a resort feel, much different from Indianapolis, where we were last year. So let's move on to the next slide. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Sam. And thank you, Jonathan and Sam, for joining us, and enjoy the program, everyone.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to GSA for having us. My name is Sam Fazio. I am with the Alzheimer's Association. I am the PI on this grant from NIH called LINC-AD, along with Cheryl Zimmerman. And it's really all about creating a network or a consortium of psychosocial researchers to really look at measures and to see how person-centered they are in their development and their delivery. And then also look at areas that either need improvement or additional work, and share that through different opportunities and dissemination. And so our network has called for papers in a supplement of the Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal related to measurement. We have funding opportunities through our international grants program through a special announcement called ARCOM, looking at measurement issues. We have webinars yearly. This year we partnered with GSA to do this 3-webinar series. And we have a variety of networking events throughout the year, in capping everything off at GSA in the fall with receptions and breakfasts and other opportunities, including a big presence in the exhibit hall. So if you want to learn more about LINC-AD, you could go to alz.org/LINC-AD. There's a box to sign up and also ways to sort of look at some of our activities and our accomplishments. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Jonathan Jackson. We're so happy for him to be here with us today. He's part of our LINC-AD network and has presented his talk to our research steering committee and has a modified version here for all of you, which we're so grateful for him to be part of it. So Jonathan, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself so that I just don't read your bio, and you could talk about the most important parts of yourself. So turn it over to you, Jonathan. Thank you. And just one reminder, go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. And at the end, I will field all those questions to Jonathan. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Sam. And thank you to GSA as well as LINC-AD and the Alzheimer's Association for inviting me to present to all of you today. I am here to talk about what I hope will be sort of the opening salvo towards understanding a science of engagement and recruitment that is deeply and rigorously quantified. So there's going to be a lot in here. I'm going to have to move pretty fast. So please pop those questions in the chat if you've got them, and I will try to save plenty of time at the end so that we can discuss in more depth. Quick disclosure slide. It looks busy. It's not. I'm just telling you where my money has come from in the past, where it comes from currently, and what we spend it on. There's not much here that I think would be surprising to most people. But what I really want to do here is start with this particular slide, which is a quote that I think is very common in the health equity space, where we discuss the sentiment from Martin Luther King at the end of the Selma marches, where he said, of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. And I think when we hear this quote, we often think about the segregation that was going on contemporaneously with MLK. We may think of the Tuskegee syphilis study, but I think injustice in healthcare may take a slightly different form. And so what I want to do here is instead, I want to present some data. This is data from the Aduhelm trials, so Emerge and Engage. Now, I know that we have data available with respect to diversity from the Clarity-AD trial. I do have some concerns about how those demographics were reported, so I'm not going to present those here. It is worth noting, however, that in that particular, in the Clarity-AD trial, powering the study for LINC-AD, we can see that any group, every group, even those that were well represented, every group of high risk of Alzheimer's disease, I think they saw uncertain benefit in that particular trial. But let's just turn our attention back to these data from Emerge and Engage. So what we need to keep in mind here is that there are a few things worth touching on. I think it's easy to sort of jump off and say, well, the Black guy is going to talk about the Black population. But the reality is that there are a number of red flags in terms of the way that we normally think about diversified and inclusive recruitment to our most important clinical trials as we're studying dementia. So the first, I think the obvious point is the overwhelming representation of white individuals. So we've got nearly 90% across these two studies that were, and it's worth remembering, if you can cast your brain back to when we were running Emerge and Engage, this was, this was a global trial. It was run in 20 different countries. And yet we still see a representation of nearly 90%. Given that white individuals are only 16% of the global population, you really got to wonder what we're doing here and what we're prioritizing as researchers investigating dementia. The lack of diversity, though, doesn't just stop with this big blue blob that we see on this pie chart, however. The vast majority of the small slice of Asian populations that you see here, of Asian participants, they were recruited in Japan, which doesn't really tell us much about this category in Asia or about Asian descended individuals that might be living in the US. And you might have noticed here that there are 6 categories of racial and ethnic identity. But if you squint, you can really only maybe see 4. And that's because across these two trials, there was only one individual who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. And there was only one individual that identified as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So again, across the pair of these studies, 3,385 participants, 348 sites, 20 countries, just one of each of these latter 2 categories. So with that in mind, let's actually take a look at the Black individuals in the study, because I want to highlight what I meant when we were talking about this injustice in healthcare and how shocking and inhuman it might be. So this green slice that you see here is about 0.5%, and my goodness, that's pretty low. Any way you want to slice that, whether you define representativeness by census data or by burden of disease, we know that 0.5% is just way too low. Again, thinking about this purely from a social justice lens, but there's an additional wrinkle when we start to think about the problem of representation from a scientific lens. And that's how we can reconcile something like Black identity with APOE status, which is a really, really important part of the way that we understand and the way that we're trying to disentangle core truths about Alzheimer's disease to this day. So let's go quickly step over to the APOE data for this same pair of trials. So if we break it down by E4 carriers, so non-E4 on the left, E4 on the right, So for those of you who may not be super steeped in the world of Alzheimer's disease, and I think most of the audience here is, we know that E4 status is really thought to confer a lot of information, or it might carry a significant burden of that additional risk of the disease. So E4 carriers are often really highly sought out in these trials. So in Emerge and Engage, about 70% of the participants, so almost 3,400 participants, 70% were E4 carriers. And so what we know here, which I think is not surprising to those of you who follow these trials, is that that the E4 carriers were much more vulnerable to this amyloid-related imaging abnormality, whether it was presented in terms of microhemorrhages or edema. I got the edema data here, so that's ARIA-E. Doesn't really matter how you slice it. Doesn't really necessarily matter about the dosing. Whoever you are, if you've got the E4 allele, you are much more likely to have this higher rate of ARIA. So we see here that that E4 carriers are at some significant risk with Aduhelm. We see the same pattern of data with LINC-AD. But what's an important question is that even though this trial, again, 348 sites, 20 countries, 3,400 participants, 70% of them had the E4 allele, 90% of them were white. Is it just the case that it's mostly the white individuals who are much more likely to have this E4 allele? Actually, what I want to do is I want to show you some data that breaks down the likelihood of presenting with an E4 allele by race and ethnicity. And what we can see here is the big winner, the group that is, that has a 20% chance, 1 in 5 Black individuals are likely to present with that E4. So when I present this, you might have some mixed feelings. On one hand, holy cow, does this mean that our new cutting edge drugs like Aduhelm and LINC-AD, does it mean that that these drugs may not work as well, or they may come with additional burdens for Black individuals? So a group that is that's thought to be at the highest risk of the disease may be at the highest risk of side effects from our cutting edge treatments. And then on the other hand, how is a population that is at significantly increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, significantly increased chance for presenting with this E4 allele, how are they only 0.5% of 2 major clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease? And with LINC-AD, if the data are to be believed, it's only 3.5% or maybe 3% of that population. How are we missing the mark on diversity that significantly? But this is really what I mean when I talk about solving the problem of convenience sampling within our world of late stage clinical trials, for clinical research more broadly, but especially at these latter stages of testing out new and novel therapies. We've got lots of historic racism, systemic exclusion, and all of these really conspire to put high risk groups at fundamentally unknown additional risk. This is what we mean when we talk about injustice in healthcare in 2023. And I think that's really worth thinking about it. So, ultimately, when it comes to understanding the risks and the benefits of these cutting edge therapies in Alzheimer's disease for Black individuals, it is a big question mark. We might think that ApoE is perhaps fundamentally different in Black individuals because of the mediation by ABCA7. We simply don't know. And we really can't know because despite having every scientific incentive to recruit Black and Latinx individuals into our research studies, it looks like these samples just weren't convenient enough. These populations weren't available enough or willing enough to participate in the research studies. And so we didn't solve for that really important context that justifies ongoing and contemporaneous racism in research. And now the consequence is that not only do we not fully understand what's going on with Aduhelm and LINC-AD in Black individuals, there's a really good chance that we may have missed something fundamental about Alzheimer's disease itself. We now have to ask the question, do we understand Alzheimer's? Not just in Black people, but overall. So I think that's enough for kind of this particular foray. I want to just quickly touch on policy to kind of understand a little bit more about the perspective that we're in. So we have tried to eliminate this specter of racism, of selection bias and abuses. But what we ended up not doing, what we ended up failing to do, is to truly address this last aspect, which is thinking carefully about justice. So the Belmont report talks about respect for persons. It talks about beneficence. It talks a little bit about justice, but we don't have clear operationalization of this. We didn't solve for the overriding motivator, that drove these abuses in the years before the Belmont Commission and the Belmont Report were published in the 70s, which is that researchers fundamentally sought after populations that were reasonably convenient, not necessarily scientifically justified, but just convenient. And so what we see here is, since the 1970s, there have been 30, maybe up to 36 aspirational policies. We know that in the recent weeks, there was a triggering of the DEPICT Act for FDA clinical trials, such that there are diversity action plans that are being recruited. Frankly, it's still pretty weak sauce in terms of thinking about subgroups. It would not necessarily have solved any of the problems that we've seen in the Alzheimer's clinical trials, but we know that we keep trying to do this. And so ultimately, again, talking about injustice in healthcare and how shocking and inhuman it is, we can look at our most cutting edge technologies. We can look at genotypic and phenotypic databases. And so look at whatever category you'd like. Maybe we'll focus on the neurologic phenotypic databases, where we see that we have an overrepresentation of this European group. We have significantly fewer individuals in the Asian category, and everyone that is not European or Asian is thrown into this other bucket. And you can see that across all of these, especially in neurologic databases, we see relatively poor representation here as well. What's important to know about these is that even with these three categories, we know that European doesn't represent all European. It really, by and large, represents Western Europeans who are living in the United States or descended from Western Europeans. So we're really talking about US-based white people in the European category. The Asian category is primarily Han Chinese in a handful of databases that are largely firewalled from the rest of the world. Anyone else that may be included in a relatively, again, poorly defined Asian category are, again, also not represented. And then people who look like me and people who don't look like me are thrown into this other category. And statistically speaking, other is not particularly useful in helping clarify any sort of potential advantages or disadvantages due to race or ethnicity. So what I'm trying to hint at here is that when we don't have good representation in our research, this is not just a failure of social justice. That should be enough to do something about it. But the reality is that when we don't have representative sampling in our research, it undermines causal inference. It undermines the four fundamental abilities. We can, I think, very easily understand how a lack of diversity and a lack of representation affects external validity. But it turns out that there are major consequences, negative consequences to construct validity, internal validity, and statistical conclusion validity all along the way. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like in real time from the world of Alzheimer's disease. So if you've seen me give it a talk anytime in the last 3 years, I have presented this next slide, but I think it really is eye-opening. So Carrie Gleason and colleagues from the University of Wisconsin-Madison looked at the data from the NAC data set. So again, one of our largest data sets on dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And what they found was that for individuals unimpaired at baseline, there was not necessarily a big difference between white and Black individuals in terms of progression to mild cognitive impairment. When you look at the mild cognitive impairment data, there was a really big racial disparity in terms of progression from MCI to frank dementia. But the direction of this disparity kind of flies in the face of everything that we know about Alzheimer's disease and risk. And racialized risk, that is to say. We see here that according to this Kaplan-Meier curve, the steeper rate of decline that you see for the white group in this graph on the right shows that it seems that white individuals are progressing at faster using this cross-sectional data set relative to Black individuals. So I've sprinkled a few GIFs in this talk to help you kind of keep in mind to kind of reconcile maybe what you should be feeling as you're looking at these figures. So there's something going on here. Maybe maybe somebody, maybe an RA like mislabeled the data. Like it seems strange that we're seeing something along these lines. It turns out that there's something called the healthy worker bias. That can really easily account for this data. Those of you who have done any epidemiological training know that this is a classic example of an unmeasured confounder. What was this unmeasured confounder? Turns out that it was recruitment source. If all of the white people are coming from a memory clinic and all of the Black people are coming from a community setting, then what you have is a classic situation where you have this unmeasured confounder of recruitment source that is rendering this group really impossible to compare. So ultimately, you're comparing a relatively lower risk population coming from a high risk setting, which are memory clinics, and a relatively higher risk population coming from a lower risk setting, which are Black individuals coming from coming from a community event, for example. So if you see this and you aggregate this happening at 60 sites across the US and Canada, then that is how you end up with the data that we saw here in the NAC data set. So we really need to be careful and cautious about what we mean when we talk about diversified recruitment. It is not just enough to have individuals that fit a certain racial identity. They're not truly comparable to any other population or group that we're trying to test. So what this means is that we need to be thoughtful about this issue related to representation science. But unfortunately, the field itself is not really well defined. The field is fragmented. There are lots of confounds. We don't actually know what a minority is. If anyone can give me like a good definition that scales of minority, I'll give you the jacket off my back. And then there is the deeply cynical question, which is most of the recruitment that we see that's diversified, is that just the byproduct of a charismatic, underpaid CRC? When that individual goes off to medical school or graduate school and recruitment collapses, is there anything that can be done by the remaining members of the study team? And then beyond the fact that the field is fragmented and that there are lots of confounds in this work, there's not really a strong infrastructure. We don't have much to work on. We don't really have experts, tools, resources that are available. When study staff are dedicated to recruitment, it usually is relatively divorced from the detailed research protocol. And so that means is that systemic failures are usually left to individual research participants, or again, best case scenario, they're left to individual study teams to navigate. So again, if you're not quite sure how to feel about all of this, there's a GIF. I think most people will say, all right, I'm going to leave this whole thing of representation science, and I'm out of here. I don't really know what to do. So that kind of gives rise to this next question. How and when and why should we try to put these two worlds together? They don't really seem to work together. If you try to do something related to health justice, it seems like you got to throw statistics out the door. You can't have a rigorous study. If you try to have a very tightly controlled, rigorous research study, then it seems like you can't have the diversity. Like you're throwing too much variance into your model, is what many people say. It's just too hard to bring these two worlds together. For me, I think that's not true. And so the work that I've done at the Care Research Center over the last few years really starts with this quote, this tongue-in-cheek quote that was written and that has nothing to do with diversity, but was nonetheless, I think, very accurate by Lou Lasagna, who said the incidence of patient availability sharply decreases when a clinical trial begins and returns to its original level as soon as the trial is completed. In other words, we as researchers, especially those of us who are leading studies, have no idea how many people are going to sign up for a study. We have no idea where recruitment is going to come from and what it's going to look like. There is a corollary to Lou Lasagna's law, Munch's third law, which says take however many people you think are going to sign up for your trial, divide it by 10, and that is a more accurate estimate of what recruitment is going to look like. So this is true for overall recruitment. It turns out that it's also true when it comes to recruiting historically marginalized minoritized populations. So why can't we recruit populations that have these diverse identities? It turns out that it doesn't really matter what your design looks like, what group you're trying to look for, what sort of setting you're conducting your research in. It is going to be some combination of these 11 factors. I have yet to find a recruitment problem related to diversity that doesn't fall onto this list. So the issue is not that we don't know why this is happening. The issue is that we do know. We just don't necessarily know which of these 11 reasons are operating within our individual research protocols, we don't necessarily know how to allocate resources, time and expertise to address whichever ones are the most significant constraints on diversified and inclusive recruitment. So what we've done at my research center is we've tried to workflow this problem. So instead of just having a laundry list of 11 reasons and effectively just needing to pick one at random, we have started with a modified workflow that says that you're going to need to start with understanding and identifying a sampling frame, move through certain decisional stages to the classic aspects of your research, and then obviously additionally consider elements related to retention. So what you've got here is an ordered workflow of decisional stages. And what's key to keep in mind here is that it's really only the stages in green that we have detailed protocols for in our clinical research studies to this day. Everything else is effectively left either to chance or social privilege, which is why it is, again, so hard to potentially address this problem, let alone quantify it. So what I think this might open us up to is leveraging a lot of expertise, a lot of validated investigational approaches and well-developed statistical analytic techniques from other fields to start to help us understand these different stages that affect representativeness and inclusive recruitment into our research studies. It turns out we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to start borrowing from lots and lots of other fields who have been thinking about this problem or these problems for a really long time. Now, what I want to keep in mind, though, is let's think a little bit beyond that workflow. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the talk. But recognizing that this idea of reconciling and connecting principles of research rigor with principles of health equity helps us to understand that when we think about diversity, it's not just a problem in its own right, but it may be the canary in the coal mine. It may be the easiest way for us to understand the larger systemic scientific problems that may be plaguing our studies. So let's talk a little bit about biological disparities. Historically, when we saw and when we observed differences between groups, we invented lots and lots of reasons, ranging from their genes don't work very well to God decided that it must be this way, to reify the differences between people who look like me and people who don't, frankly. Over the years, we have started to move in the direction of recognizing that there are lots of environmental exposures and social and structural inequities that drive a huge percent of the variance of this. And there's relatively little variance that may be assigned to biological disparities. What I believe is that even this latter view is still somewhat limited. Instead, we need to be thinking about what I'm terming a 5-part model that includes aspects of selection, measurement, and implementation, in addition to understanding social and biological group differences. And so what this means is that there are lots and lots of problems that we see when it comes to failures of diversity or socialized inequities. But instead of saying that all of the problems are at the level of the individual or at the level of society, these additional sources of bias and error and at the selection, measurement, and implementation stage say that there are limitations and there are questions related to our own scientific designs that are really, really necessary to recognize here. Now, what is important about this is not just the fact that we can split 2 categories into 5 and call it good. What becomes important is recognizing that if you have a problem of measurement, you don't need to necessarily use tools related to social inequities to solve it. You can use tools for measurement error that have been designed to address measurement error, for example, to specifically address these problems. So what I'm presenting to you here is that a lack of diversity, which may be manifested at any one of these 5 stages, can give way towards a very creative set of solutions that may be otherwise really, really hard to recognize. So for example, if you find that there's a selection bias, you can't get diverse people into your research study, and you're trying to solve it using solutions related to social inequities, you may find that unless you have very, very careful, charismatic individuals on your team, these solutions are too downstream from the problem in order to solve it. So This is a set of solutions that may be implemented to solve the right problem at the right time for it. Now, I wanted to give you an example of what this workflow, what this kind of predictive model looks like in action. And so we're going to go with a relatively safe, uncontroversial topic of understanding what we should be doing with racial identity in our studies. So when we are thinking about race, we might think about it as a risk factor for disease. And we often use racial identity, usually self-identified racial identity, for one of the following reasons. We use it as a construct, a variable, or as a marker for racism in our studies. But what I want to emphasize to you is that none of these are appropriate or valid conditions for using racial identity in our studies. Let's break down what I mean by that. If we talk about race as a construct, we know that it is a poor and really poorly correlated proxy of socioeconomic factors. There are lots of reasons for this, but we have to keep in mind that race doesn't really have a stable empirical definition. And so if you tend to rely on race as a construct in your studies, if you use it in your models, you're going to see some hit, not just to external validity, but also internal and statistical conclusion validity. If you try to use race as a variable in your study, we know that it's not a great marker of genetic variation and ancestry. And one of the reasons for that is because race is tied to the US Census and it changes its definition every decade. It has not been stable for centuries in the United States. We also know that these definitions don't export well. They don't transfer to other countries. And so beyond that, we also know that if we try to use race as variable, especially as a predictor in our studies, we inadvertently baseline and normed privileged identities, which really sacrifice all kinds of validity in our studies. And then finally, if we try to use it as an indicator of racism, it tends to erase bias from the work from the bias that we introduce as researchers and clinicians. We also see that if we try to use race as an indicator of racism, it tends to shift the focus from the barriers, from the societal structures to individuals, where it is reified and sort of mixed up with a bunch of other things. And it tends to create really misleading monoliths, both for racial minorities as well as racial majorities. So many people, when they hear this black guy saying we shouldn't be using race the way that we're using it, they might feel, let's be charitable and say confused. But let me kind of walk you through a little bit more about what I mean. Instead of relying on something that is really shaky like racial identity, think about your mechanism of action. Unless you're doing something related to skin conditions or pulse oximeters, your mechanism of action is not going to be the amount of melanin in someone's skin. It's just not going to be that. So do your best to measure whatever mechanism, environment, or exposure that you're looking for instead. And now, if you're using secondary data analyses and you just don't have the ability to do it, I understand. But again, think about what may be powering your group differences in an a priori fashion, and use that to motivate your study, motivate your analyses, rather than engaging in post hoc reasoning to try to understand what's going on here. Leverage much more useful group differentiators. You should really consider a standardized set of socio-environmental factors. So thinking about common data elements, there are not really great common data elements across social determinants of health, or much less for the social exposome. But the good news is that I am actually working on a range of studies that just got some good funding news over the last few weeks that will allow me to start to develop common data elements that will create a standardized interactive set of elements that may allow us to start to define the social exposome in a way that reconciles health equity research domestically with global health work happening internationally. And finally, race is not the third rail. It can help you understand and see that, what potential issues may be arising in recruitment and selection. But really, racial identity could really only ever be a marker of racial identity. If we continue to try to put it through the hard work, we really risk misunderstanding what it is that we're trying to observe here. And so, I'm not just preaching. I'm preaching from lived wisdom of making this mistake myself. So the Jackson et al. 2017 paper in Age and Aging is a classic example of doing this. So again, what we saw with the Gleason paper was a reversal of a well-known racial inequity. And so that made it really, really easy to spot. But what if we see something like this? where we correlated subjective and objective memory measures. We saw that we saw the expected pattern in white individuals. We did not see any correlation between these measures in Black individuals. We went back to the individual measures that made up each of these composites. And we saw that there was great internal correlation for these across the both racial identity groups. But again, we just didn't see it. So, in matching so what was really interesting here is we matched the sample on age, education, MMSE scores, reading ability. We actually inadvertently introduced a difference in depression. But the bottom line is that because this was in the expected direction, we expected these tests to work better in white people than they did in Black people. And so we reported on this difference in a paper that looks really exciting and really interesting, but it is a conflation of at least 4 of the 5 sources of bias that we see here. And so what I'm actually here to say is we can't trust the data in these papers. So this match sample of white individuals are not truly comparable to the match sample of Black individuals, and these groups don't generalize to the broader populations, on either side of this racial divide. So this is one clear case where, because it moved in the expected direction, because we expected these assessments to be more predictive in one population than another, we didn't think twice about these data. But now I'm not so sure, and I think you should also be similarly very, very careful if you're going to be using a racial identity in your studies. So I have what I call the Drake rule. So instead of using race as a marker of group differences, you can see Drake is looking away. No, I don't want to do that. Instead, what he's kind of given his thumbs up to is using specific exposures and mechanisms as a marker of group differences. So if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember the Drake rule, because I think it is well motivated by science. So for the next few minutes, I do want to talk a little bit about these different sources of bias and how you can recognize and overcome them in your research studies. The first example, it comes from a long collaboration that we've had with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for about 5 years now, 6 years now, I guess, that talk about accrual to a digital study. So if you think about what Michael J. Fox Foundation studies, they study Parkinson's disease, which usually has to be diagnosed by a neurology subspecialist, which is really hard to get to. So instead of having people fill out surveys at these brick and mortar institutions, they thought to themselves, let's just recruit from an online study. Because there's no travel time, because this is universally accessible, we should definitely see better representation among all populations. Here's what they saw before we got involved. And so if you can't really read those categories on the bottom, maybe you're looking at this on a smartphone. Trust me, this graph is white for a reason. So of the first 25,000 participants, 88, almost 89% of them were white. It actually goes beyond ethno-racial representation. We see the education level. You might look at that first bar and say, well, okay, 1 in 3 people has a bachelor's degree. That seems fine. It seems fine until you look at some of these other categories where you recognize that master's degree is split out from professional degree, which is split out from doctoral degree. So keep in mind, 6% of these individuals had a doctoral degree. And if you roll that together with professional and master's degree, we're looking at well over 1/3 of the participants had some sort of advanced education in the study. And this is my favorite slide. If you look at the mode of the distribution, almost 1/3 of the individuals in the study had a median household income of over $100,000. So again, so just making something available online, if you build it, they will come, was just did not work out for this particular study. So what I've got here is a very clear sign of how you should be thinking about these data. This ain't it. So we launched the Fire Up PD study. We're actually deep into the second version of the study now, with with plans for a third coming out this fall. And so what we did is we used that recruitment funnel that I mentioned to you earlier, focusing on these early stages of a clearly identified group for recruitment, building awareness, motivating individuals, creating really, really great trust and engagement. And what we saw here is that when you broadly define minority, so for this sample, it was basically everybody that wasn't Michael J. Fox, frankly. So we had broad representation of diversity from race, ethnicity, gender, education, income, and rurality. And we had a really, really strong focus on the sampling frame. So the study was, this first study was relatively small. We had 8 sites for control. Every site identified a barrier experienced by a specific population and an intervention to overcome that barrier for that population. We gave people, frankly, not that much money and not that much time to solve this problem. Most of the interventions focused on engaging with community individuals living with Parkinson's disease, or physicians, either general neurologists or occasionally primary care doctors. And every site that ended up doing an intervention had a really multi-pronged approach to address these barriers. And so even though the study was not powered at all to look at recruitment, it was just powered to think about attitudes towards engagement. What we see here is that control, again, a passive control condition, they were supposed to be doing nothing at all. Nonetheless, a control condition saw a huge jump relative to their own baseline in terms of accrual to this digital study. And then intervention populations saw a big jump across all categories. So keeping in mind that low income and low education individuals were split out from the non-white and Latinx categories. So in other words, we're saying that these are relatively low income and relatively low education white individuals, which were not specifically or explicitly targeted by any one site. So what we see here is that caring about inclusion, it creates this phenomenon of a rising tide lifting all boats. And so another thing that we realized from this particular study is a clear understanding that what we think of as a single distribution of recruitment over time may instead be better conceptualized as the conflation of 3 different recruitment waves. So the first wave, which often happens right when you launch a study, is a relatively short duration. It happens very quickly, and it's very, very highly privileged. And so what we realize is that we don't necessarily need to engage in this entire recruitment workflow in order to capture these individuals. There's relatively low researcher effort. The second wave is less fast. It's a little bit slower. It may take weeks. And what we see here is that it's a middling duration. And you see that you might need to build a little bit of literacy. You might need to establish a little bit of a return of value or a kind of an equity statement for these individuals. So it's going to require a bit more effort. This long-term wave, which is long-acting and very sustainable over time, does require engagement across this entire workflow. And it does have the best representativeness, but it does take a significant researcher effort. In other words, when we're recruiting across multiple waves for a study, we will need to change and evolve our tactics in order to engage what are effectively 3 different recruitment frames or 3 different populations even for these studies. The last point that I want to make about this is recognizing that there are participant barriers to getting involved in these studies. And so historically, when you talk about engaging racial and ethnic minorities, the number one factor that most researchers cite is mistrust. People aren't doing the study because they don't trust us. By very carefully measuring participant barriers in this study with Parkinson's disease, we saw that the number one reason why a group that wanted to participate but couldn't was language equity. So, because we only collected survey responses in English, individuals that wanted something to be written in traditional Chinese, somebody that may have wanted it to be written in Spanish, Russian, Thai, were all prevented from participating. The other issue is the digital divide. And again, here, it is not what we as researchers think it is. We usually think about the digital divide as either having access or having no access to the World Wide Web. It turns out that the digital divide is mostly about having access to these surveys, to study participation from a smartphone, rather than relying on an iPad or a laptop or a desktop computer. So again, thinking about what the real reasons why people can or can't participate, we really need to think beyond issues related to, say, mistrust. So while mistrust is high among ethno-racial minorities, it is not necessarily a reason why they will not participate in a research study. So keeping that in mind. So I'm starting to run low on time. I want to just talk very quickly about a research study called the Forever Research Study that I have. So this is an ongoing DP1 award to my center. So phase 1 is really thinking about deep phenotyping within lay communities. Where we are in the midst of recruiting over 15,000 individuals with a really deep intersectional focus on lots and lots of individuals that are not usually asked how they feel about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We have engaged and started to perfect a really novel recruitment method called relational organizing, which basically fully characterizes an entire social graph. So a social network of social networks is what we call a social graph, and then sampling representatively from it. So it means that you don't ever have to worry about a lack of representation. And so we really have, we are starting to develop really detailed mapping tools and norms and some geospatial analyses based on this. And so what's nice about this is that it will ultimately put, so this is what our NIH enrollment table looks like, but because we are thinking so deeply about what diversity is, it really will ultimately put this table out to pasture for being a bit out of date and a bit inaccurate. Phase 2, we are in the midst of this now. So if you work at an ADRC or if you're working at a RICMAR, you will probably be hearing from my team over the next few months, where we are going to be trying to understand what recruitment looks like within the Alzheimer's Centers program and various centers of excellence in the disease. And then phase 3, we are also developing a sustainable community partnership community curriculum where we are powering for intersectionally marginalized groups, in this case, trans women of color. And we're going to leverage this to help start to restructure the NIH outreach platform, which is known as ADOR. So what I want to do then is just talk a little bit about what justice and rigor might look like in other kinds of conceptions. So, oops, it looks like here we go. So just to kind of highlight work done recently by Emily Largent and Rebecca Edelmeyer, thinking about what rigor and justice looks like when trials stop early. So when we are running these clinical research studies, what is our duty to telling people who were involved in the study? Is it really fair to let them find out on the news along with the rest of us? So the recommendations are many and varied. And so there are lots and lots of complications here because there's like legal requirements, and fiduciary requirements, and medical requirements. But there really needs to be a detailed plan. We need to be thinking about justice in terms of understanding trial outcomes, especially when trials end early. And so there are lots and lots of recommendations that we had here that I think is really interesting. The other thing that I wanted to quickly highlight is emergent trends in neuroimaging. So this is work with Francis Shen, Susan Wolf, and Francis Lorenz about highly portable and cloud-based MRI technology. And so we know that broader access is good. Most of the early uses of like, say, a highly portable MRI, which could be just stuffed in the back of a van, is about reaching hard-to-reach populations. But there may be differential access. There may be a less understanding about the line between clinical research and clinical care. And so we are thinking about the ethical, legal, and social implications of these emergent cutting-edge technologies. We want to make sure that data are not identifiable. We highly expect that MRI technologies will start to use machine learning, AI-powered algorithms, but these should always be transparent. They should always be interrogable. And we really need to recognize that there is a major responsibility towards committing towards principles of communication. So there are lots of things to kind of think about here, but just to kind of summarize it, what does this all mean? We have to recognize that diversity is really a stopgap on the way for inclusion, on the way to representation. When we say DEI or JEDI or EDI, we have to recognize that these terms have never been interchangeable, and that diversity is kind of the first aspect of this. This is a floor, not a ceiling. And we really have a lot of work to do within our own house. We got to clean up science before we start to blame all of the inequities and disparities that we see on larger societal failures. There is a clear need to start to quantify some of the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We need things like common data elements. We need precision medicine. We need convergent compatibility with statistical theory in order to start to build a more careful science where we can actually start to do things like comparative effectiveness. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are lots and lots of ways that this field is going to kind of grow and evolve. And we're starting to recognize that there may be something in between epidemiology and public health and clinical research that needs defining in its own right. We're starting to see glimmers of this. If you think about how the statistics don't quite work when we're thinking about pragmatic trials, learning networks, implementation science, and other kind of cutting edge ways of understanding a contextualized world around us. It is my belief that equity is still going to be the driver of health innovation, whether we're talking about this in a research setting or a clinical care setting. Thinking about the future of precision and personalized medicine, it will necessarily be powered by adherence to really clear principles of equity. So I'm going to say all rigorous science and policy must necessarily be equitable. If it is not equitable, then it's not science. And I think that we're getting closer and closer to a reality where that's the case. Wanted to quickly thank the members of the Care Research Center, the principal sources of grant support that I currently benefit from, and I just wanted to say thanks to all of you for your time and attention. And I think I've got a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We really appreciate that, man. Every time I hear you talk, I just think about what a terrible researcher I am. So thank you so much.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah, thank you so much for challenging us to think out of the box here. And so, does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask Jonathan? We don't have anything in the chat, but feel free to add something in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand, and you're happy to go ahead and ask the question directly to Jonathan. No, he had a lot of information to share to us and some really great stuff for us to continue to think about. Well, Jonathan, I think I don't have any questions here for you. I think you got people thinking.
I clearly nailed it. Yeah, perfectly transparent.
A lot of thank yous. A lot of thank yous about how great the presentation was. Cheryl, I don't know if you're able to unmute and wanted to say anything to thank folks, but we really appreciate this opportunity to work with GSA on this webinar series. So we look forward to continued opportunities in the future, and thank you all for being here. So it looks like you do have one here, Jonathan. Just sure. Wondered if the visual of the process was available online or in a pub anywhere.
So the answer is soon, very soon, fingers crossed. We'll have that. But if there are any questions, I think we'll have this available. I'll also drop my email in the chat, and I can send you this information, just because I think it is a useful way of thinking about equity. So my email's in the chat, jjackson31@partners.org. Please feel free to send me an email or a message if you have any questions, or if you want access to any of the information that I presented today.
Looks like there were a couple other questions too that popped in here.
Sure.
Cheryl wants to continue to figure out how LINC-AD can help promote the work that you're doing, and so please keep us in mind. For different ways that we could share it with the network, or different ideas that you might have for working together in some way through the journal supplements or anything. But any way that we could help share this, we would love to. Someone else asked, how does this work fit with CBPR?
Ooh, great question. So if I flip back to this very complicated model, so something like CBPR is really, really good. So let me say that CBPR is a very broad class of ways of engaging with community. I'm sorry, for anybody who doesn't know the acronym, it's community-based participatory research. And so that covers things like community advisory boards, community engaged research, community partnered research, community-based action-oriented research. All of that is kind of under this broad umbrella. And so depending on the kind of CBPR, they are actually optimized for different elements of this workflow. So a community advisory board may help you understand some aspects of implementation and design. If you have like a really, really deeply thoughtful, great community partnership that's deeply community engaged and maybe community-led or community-powered, it can help you solve issues related to selection bias, especially something like measurement error. And of course, if you are working very carefully, then you should have a really good grasp on socialized and structural inequities. So depending on the CBPR, you should be able to address up to 4 of these 5 elements. If it is truly community-led, which I think may represent something that's beyond our CBPR approaches, you might start to be able to understand things, in this range of really either essentialized or biological disparities. But this is a solution set that may work really, really well at multiple levels of error and bias.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. So, Katie, I saw that you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to wish that we could have either the slides, but somebody else said that, or a tape of what Jonathan said.
Yeah, I think
so we
you
can
will
go
have
over
both.
with our notes.
Yeah, I think you
Yeah.
will have both. Jen will tell you where those are housed on GSA, and then we'll also link to them from LINC-AD. So that's a good segue into you, Jen. You want to have the final word and remind folks where they can find the presentation afterwards.
Sure, they'll be available right in the webinar section of our website, the GSA website, and all three programs will be there together as the series, and they will include the video and audio recording and the PDF of the materials. So those will be available. I want to again thank Sam for his partnership in pulling this together, and Cheryl Zimmerman was also able to join us for our last webinar to serve as our host. So we appreciate her work as well. Jonathan, your talk was terrific. I have to say, when I saw all the slides, I thought, he'll never get through this, but you sure did. It was great. Terrific information, and we really appreciate your contribution to our programming here. It was a great presentation. So thanks to our colleagues at the Alzheimer's Association and Jonathan for your wonderful presentation today. Be well, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye.